Greetings from New York City and Columbia Business School Executive Education. I'm Scott Gardner, and I'm here today with Professor Angela Lee for today's webinar, Long-Term Vision in a Short-Term World. Before I introduce Angela, I'd like to go over a few quick logistics. If you'll look at your screen right now, a recording of this webinar will be emailed to you. If you'd like to tweet about this webinar, please do so at #CBSExecEd. Finally, most importantly, please submit those questions to the Q&A box. Angela and I will get to as many of those as possible in the last 10 minutes. My pleasure to introduce Professor Angela Lee. She is the Professor of Practice and Chief Innovation Officer at Columbia Business School, where she teaches top-rated courses in venture capital and leadership. She has launched 4 startups in her career and is also the founder of the investing network 37 Angels. Angela has spoken at NASA and is regularly invited to advise decision makers at the highest levels, including Prime Minister Trudeau. She was recognized by Inc. magazine as one of 17 inspiring women to watch in 2017 and by Crain's as notable women in tech in 2019. Angela, it's great to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Scott.
I'm going to leave the stage. I'll join you in the last 10 minutes of the webinar for some Q&A. But before I do, let me just ask you to kick this off. Given how fast-paced today's world is, what recommendations do you have for people who are setting strategy?
Thanks for asking the question. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And so in terms of Scott's question, it is very true that we are often asked to think in this long-term, strategic, forward-looking way. Yet the reality is that many of us are rewarded, we are incentivized, we are sometimes punished for things that happen very short-term. So how do you think about balancing those two, what sometimes feel like opposing forces? So a lot of us are used to processes that look something like this, right? So we're asked to do a bunch of market research, we're looking at data, we're maybe looking at customer testimonials, then we're gonna put together that annual strategic plan, maybe it happens at the beginning of the year, the end of the year. Then we're asked to think about things like budget and resources and cost, and then we go ahead and implement, and then we do it all again the very next year. Unfortunately, most of us are not in situations and contexts where we can do this, certainly not on an annual basis, and we're working in much more agile environments. So a framework I want to offer in alternative is you first want to define success in a little bit more of an open way. Then you want to think about what are the assumptions that are going into your definition of success and how might you want to pressure test them a little bit. And then I want you to think about how to run rapid failing experiments and to get lazy. So I'm going to give you an analogy to compare this to. I don't know how many of you all are actually old enough to remember the days of MapQuest, but I certainly am. And I remember when I had to go from destination A to destination B, what would I do? I would go onto mapquest.com, I would type in my address, and I would print out a document that looked something like this. Right, it would say, go right here, go left here, and I would be driving and having the paper next to me. I'm sure it was horribly dangerous, right? But that was how a lot of us had to get to destinations, which is why, thankfully, there are much better solutions these days. Waze is a great example. I'm assuming a lot of you have used Waze. Waze does the same thing in the sense that it lets you go and say, I want to go here. But it allows you to be experimental and agile as you get there. So if there's a traffic jam, if there's an accident, maybe there's a police trap on a certain freeway, it says, okay, we're gonna go around that, or I'm gonna give you a warning. And Waze is saying, I still know where you wanna get to, but it's saying, let's be agile in how you get there. And so the idea is, how do you do that from a business sense? So think Waze, not MapQuest. So let's start with defining success. I think what a lot of us do is we define success in an incredibly narrow, results-oriented way. So let's think about one that a lot of us might be thinking about maybe going into the holiday season or at any time of the year, which is I want to lose 10 pounds or 5 kilos for those of you who are using the metric system, right? And thinking about, okay, that's a very results-driven goal. How do you step back and say, why do I care about this definition of success? Why is it that I want to lose 10 pounds? And so for some of us, we want to maybe live a long and healthy life, and we want to travel with our spouse. This is my primary reason, and it's something that I actually have. I have a health journal, I'm a big journaler, and it's something that I definitely think about. When I think about why I want to be healthy, there's an overarching goal. Or it might be that you have grandkids that you want to stay up to as they're running around and you want to be able to play hide and seek with them or tag with them, whatever the case may be. So taking a step back from the result of the very specific thing of what the weight you want to lose into why is it that you want to lose that weight. A business example might be, I'm sure a lot of us are asked to sell so much of whatever by the end of Q4. Well, why is that important? So if you work in pharmaceuticals, maybe you would reframe that into something like, well, I actually want to save suffering from fibromyalgia or from cancer, whatever the case may be. So how do you reframe that into a broader why? Or maybe if you just really can't tie a broader, maybe societal goal to it, even thinking for yourself personally, I want to be a senior leader so that I can enable change. But the idea is to take a step back from a kind of metrics-driven, result-driven definition of success and saying, how do I think in a more broad, holistic way of why that metric truly matters to me? So that's kind of step one. And then once you do that, it allows you to think, okay, there are actually more ways to get to my definition of success than just that one metric that I was originally thinking of. So that's step one. Then you want to test your assumption. Now, a lot of us are asked to test our assumptions. We've all heard this before, but how do you do it? So I just want to share with you kind of a good list of questions that I keep in my back pocket as I'm doing this. For example, when people say, what do you not know? It can be very difficult to list out the things that you don't know. And whenever I ask that question to a client or a senior executive team, I get a lot of blank stares back. So something that I find can be helpful to break down is to think about state versus effect unknowns. So a state unknown is a future state. Is it going to rain? I don't know. Is it not? And then an effect unknown would be, what is the effect on that state? So for example, if it rains, do customers like to be indoors? Maybe I have a hot dog stand. Is that going to impact my business positively or negatively? If I have an umbrella stand, maybe it's actually going to affect it positively. And what you'll find is that the state unknown, it's very hard to determine what the answer to that state is going to be. And usually as a customer, you don't have a lot of impact over the state. I can't impact the weather. But effect unknowns, you can, first of all, find out about, and you can do something about it. So if I take a business example, something a lot of us might be thinking about, are we going into a recession, right? That's something that people are always thinking about. What is the business macroeconomic environment going to look like next year? A, I can't predict that. And B, it's very, very hard for me to impact the state of the broader economy. But if I think about the effect unknowns, so let's say you're working for a financial services company, then do we care about the fact that in a recession, do people increase their savings rate or decrease their savings rate? In a recession, do people use financial advisors more or do they use financial advisors less? First of all, I can figure that out by doing some customer research, looking at historical data, but also I can impact the outcome of that, meaning I can do customer education, I can do marketing, I can do some customer outreach. And so I find that when I ask people to separate their unknowns into state unknowns versus effect unknowns, people kind of go, whew, take a deep breath. I can start to quantify my unknowns, but I also can start to do something about them. I also just have a list of questions that I like to keep in my back pocket around questions that I'll use to pressure test people, which is, what don't you know about your customers? What assumptions might you be making? What don't you know about your competitors? What assumptions might you be making? What defines success for the organization? What context matters in terms of the organization? What stakeholders exist that you might not be thinking about? I'll give you an example for Columbia Business School. We oftentimes think about faculty, students, administration. We should also be thinking about recruiters. Even something like alum. The context of what matters to somebody who's 2 to 5 years out of business school versus somebody who is 25 years out of business school, very, very different. So being precise about all the different stakeholders that exist, I find will help you to highlight what are the assumptions that we're making about them. And then more questions to keep in your back pocket, some validation questions that you might want to ask yourself. I think that this is the right path to go forward. What would have to hold true for that to be the right thing to do? What assumptions am I making? If I had a magic 8-ball in my hand right now and I'm like, I could ask it 3 questions, what might I ask it? Or if I could find the expert on X topic, what would that X topic be? And then devil's advocate, someone's got to play it, right? So what might be a question that you're like, oof, what's keeping you up at night? What are you worried about? I find that especially if this is a project that a senior leader is very excited about, the devil's advocate questions can sometimes be hard for people to answer. So this is the case where maybe I slide a Post-it note across the table and I say, okay, there's 8 people in the room. It can be very hard for you to voice why the CEO's idea is a bad idea. But if I give everyone a Post-it note and ask them to write it down, it can be easier for people to voice their concerns. A free tool you can use online is polleverywhere.com. Again, a nice way to get anonymized feedback from a really wide group of people when they might feel uncomfortable because people don't like being a naysayer. So I find that when I do this with a group of 6 to 8 people in a room, that I will all of a sudden get 100 Post-it notes with questions, assumptions, unknowns, concerns, and that might feel overwhelming. Oh my gosh, now I've got 100 Post-it notes to deal with. But I find that if you get that stuff out of people's heads, it allows them to be a little bit more creative. It lets them take a deep breath. Okay, all that stuff that was swirling around in my head that was keeping me up at night, it's on a piece of paper and I can start to go through them. We help them prioritize and all that kind of stuff. But the idea is it's a brain dump and it's a collective brain dump. I've gotten the best thinking out of a group of people in an organized way. That said, now we have all these questions and unknowns. How do you solve them? So what I want folks to think about is I now imagine you have 100 Post-it notes in front of you of questions, unknowns, things that you're trying to figure out. How do you rapidly experiment and answer those questions? So for example, let's say you work for a consumer packaged goods company and you are trying to figure out what the packaging should look like and where the item should be on the shelf. So one way to rapidly experiment, and companies like Procter & Gamble, Unilever have done this, is they build a fake supermarket. And they literally test different packaging, and they put these cameras on people's heads that track their eye movement, track where their arms are reaching, and they watch how shoppers go through the aisles to figure out, okay, are people looking top and bottom? What happens if you've got something at the end of an aisle versus the middle of the aisle? Do people ever even look at that bottom aisle stuff? And it really allows them to see consumer behavior. Building a supermarket, though, is pretty darn hard. It takes a lot of resources, and you have to be a company of a certain size to do that. And so something I want to encourage you to do is how do you get even lazier? So think about the experiment, think about the pilot, but before you test anything, you have to first ask yourself, how do I get lazier? Which is a weird thing to do, right? We're often told to work harder, but no. I want you to say, okay, here's the question I have. Here's the experiment I want to run. Before you run it, ask yourself, how do I answer this question in an even lazier way? So for example, you could use technology, and a lot of consumer packaged goods companies have done this, which is they have created virtual reality situations where instead of building a supermarket, you can throw, a virtual reality headset on somebody and have them pretend to go through a supermarket, and you can get very similar information, but you can now mail a headset to someone's home. Or you can have them go into a studio. You don't have to build a supermarket. You can do this all over the world and get consumer behaviors that differ by geography, for example. And so that is a lazier way to get the same information. I'm going to give you a couple of other lazy ideas. So one might be, I'm sure a lot of you have been asked to determine consumer interest, right? Consumer willingness to pay, consumer likelihood of purchasing a product. And what do we all do? We do a survey. Right? So first of all, consumers are very, very bad at predicting their future behavior, especially when it comes to money. And secondly, it can be very hard to run a pilot, because the best thing to do is obviously we run a pilot, we launch it in 3 cities, and we see what the uptick is. But that can be difficult to do. So how do you get lazier but still get good, high quality consumer sentiment data? One thing you can do is what's called a landing page. So this is an example of a landing page. And it's basically bloppity bloppity blop. Our thing is launching in 6 months. If you're interested in that thing, give us your email address. You haven't built the thing, right? But what you can do is you can say, okay, here is, we sent this to 10,000 people, and this description of the thing got 1,000 email addresses, and this description of the thing got 500 email addresses. Ooh, this is the thing that resonates more with customers. So I'll give you an example. When I'm not at Columbia, I invest in early stage startups, as Scott mentioned. And one of the things that we looked at recently was Owlet. It's a baby monitor, right? And so, for example, before Owlet launched with their baby monitor, what they could have done is put up 2 landing pages. One landing page would say, here's our baby monitor. It will prevent SIDS. versus here's another baby monitor, and it's going to give you micro data on your baby, right? It's going to tell you how many times they roll over, how many times they wake up, how many times they wet their diaper in the middle of the night. And what did we find out? Millennials love microdata, right? So all of a sudden, I know to build this baby monitor versus this baby monitor, but I haven't actually built a thing. So I test it with the market before I build it. That's what a landing page allows you to do. With 3 lines of text, it allows you to test consumer interest. Another way to do this is through just playing with kind of premium features. So this is an example, Fleego, right? They had a free product, and they said, we could build 15 different new features, but I don't know which ones to build. And so they could have done consumer surveys, they could have done a pilot, but what did they do instead? They took the 4 bullet points at the bottom and they kept changing them. So sometimes they had 1, 3, and 7. Sometimes they had 2, 5, and 8. And then they played with the pricing, 15 a month, 100 a year, $4.99 a month. And they played with all those different combinations. And they said, what combination gets the most people to click on that top right box? All of a sudden they know those are the features to build, that's the pricing to charge. Again, test before you build. And this is a way to be lazy because the least lazy thing you can do is to build a product that nobody wants. And a lot of this comes from the startup ecosystem, right? A lot of these lessons learned. And so I wanted to share with you a couple of resources for those of you who want to learn more about this. So if I think about the 3 things that I talked about, you first want to define success in an open and broad way. Then you want to test your assumptions with some of the questions that I mentioned. And then you want to rapidly experiment in hopefully a lazy way. So the first book I would recommend is called Start With Why. It's by Simon Sinek. It's a great book around being more open about what success means to you. In terms of testing your assumptions, Lean Startup. It is kind of the Bible of the startup ecosystem these days. And then Rework is a great book by the folks who did 37 Signals, the company who did Basecamp. And same thing, they wrote a book called Rework. All of these have great resources, real life examples that you can use to apply to your corporate world, to your day-to-day life, whether you're working for a 3-person startup or a Fortune 50 company. These tools are applicable and useful to you in your daily lives. So with that, I want to bring Scott back up to go through some of the Q&A.
Thank you, Angela. It's very interesting information. I like your phrase lazy, but let's just, before we move on, we've got a host of questions here. When you say lazy, I'm listening, does it mean more efficient? Does it mean more, what is your definition of lazy in this context?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in terms of lazy, the 2 metrics that I most want you to think about, or actually the 2 dimensions that I most want you to be lazy about are how many people you test the idea with and how developed the idea is when you test it. So in terms of how many people you're testing the idea with, you don't always need to test something with 100,000 people in 14 different cities to get an answer. And you don't need to have a full-blown developed product to test it. So think about how can I get an answer from 500 people? And then how do I test maybe a PowerPoint description of the product or a 3D rendering of the product by using a 3D printer? And so the idea is how do I always be lazy in terms of how many people I test it with and then how developed the idea is that I'm testing.
Okay. So this question just came in from Alexander, and I think this is interesting in terms of this way of testing, this, to me, a unique modern way of testing. He says, how would you handle applying these methods when managing a group when you're half their age and have less education? Participation can be an uphill battle.
That never happens where you have to own something that you're presenting to senior people. So a couple things. I think the first thing is if you think about conflict, there's a great optical illusion that I wish I had right now, which has an optical illusion where from one direction you see 3 bars, and from the other direction you see 4 bars. Another one that I'm sure a lot of you have seen is the one, it's an image of a duck and a rabbit, depending on how you look at it. But the reason why I like to keep those images in the back of my mind is when we think about conflict, a lot of the times the conversation we're having is, it's a duck, it's a rabbit, it's a duck, it's a rabbit. The question that we should all be asking is, why do you see a duck? Why do you see a rabbit? Tell me where you think the eyes are, where the nose is, where the bill of the duck is, where the rabbit's ears are. And I find that if you change the energy of conflict, makes us all on the same side of the table. So that's kind of step number one, is to not make it seem as they don't get it, I need to present them with the idea, but just we're on the same side of the table. If they are pushing back, why do you think it's a bad idea to do this? So that would be one. And then the second thing would be to ask open questions. So as opposed to saying, this is the right thing to do, has there ever been a situation in the past where we have tested with less than a full-blown beta product? Has there been another company in our industry that's been successful in this method? And so again, asking open questions as opposed to closed questions.
Right. And also that idea of, previous people who've been with a company, let's say, not diminishing the practices from before. Absolutely. I feel like that's a stop for anybody, because even if it was unsuccessful, say they tested a product and it was really a waste of time and waste of resources, let's not bring that up here.
Right. Right.
Exactly. So bring up the past successes, not the past failures.
Absolutely.
Right? Okay, great. All right, so in the corporate world, there's an increasing emphasis on companies to take a long-term view and move away from quarterly earnings advice. So in what way can we persuade companies to think long-term, and is there conclusive evidence that shows companies perform better when they do think long-term?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is to not think that it's long-term or short-term. It is very much and, not or. So I think that's step number one. And I'm a recovering management consultant. I love a good 2x2. So a 2x2 that I often use is the two dimensions are, ease versus impact. So think about all the ideas you have for your company, and then you plot them on a 2x2 of ease versus impact. So impact is oftentimes revenue impact, right? How much revenue impact is there? And then ease is it easy or is it difficult? And then you now have projects kind of in 4 different time horizons. The things that are difficult and won't make you any money, just don't do those. But the things that are difficult but will be very impactful, those are your long-term strategic, hairy, audacious goals. And the things that are easy but maybe a little bit lower impact, those become your shorter-term 6-month goals, low-hanging fruit, whatever the case may be. And all of a sudden, it's not or, it's and. Everybody can see it, and then you've got that nice, here's your 3-year plan, 5-year plan, whatever the case may be.
Right. So on that term, we've got a company that's, let's say it's healthy and it can, institute this. Larry asks, well, can you be strategic while your business is in survival mode?
I would argue if you are never strategic, that your company is always going to be in survival mode. So as much as it sucks, and as much as you're thinking, oh my goodness, I just have to survive next quarter, sell these 3 things, and so I'm going to take on that client that I know I shouldn't. I'm going to add that feature that I know nobody wants, but this one really annoying client is asking for it. I promise you, then you're always going to be in survival mode. So you have to carve out, maybe it's just 2 hours a week, right, where you need to be thinking a little bit more strategic. Otherwise, it will never happen. For those of you who like the Eisenhower Matrix, I highly recommend that you read Stephen Covey's 7 Habits for Highly Successful People. And he talks about how we always neglect important but not urgent tasks. But if you neglect them, then all of a sudden they're going to become urgent, and then again, you'll always be in survival mode.
Right. That's great. All right, so when you were talking about state unknown and effect unknown, Camillo asks, do you have another business example of the difference between those two, just to get a little bit more of a reiteration on that?
So let's talk healthcare, right? So if you think about who the next world leader is going to be in whatever country you're in, but I'm in the U.S., I'll talk about the U.S., right? If it's going to be a Republican president or a Democratic president, that's going to wildly change healthcare, right? And thinking about how Medicare is going to work, whatever the case may be. So that is a state unknown. I don't know who the president's going to be in 2 years. But an effect unknown might be, what are the impacts of the current candidates and how might they vote? I can quantify that right now based on what I know different candidates think about different healthcare policies. And then even more importantly, what can I do to impact the outcome where, let's say you have a president who has a policy that is against whatever your company is trying to do. You can prepare for that today, right? In terms of, again, customer outreach, lobbying, whatever the case may be. But the idea is I can't control who the president is, but I can certainly, educate myself on what the potential outcomes are, and then what might I do to mitigate any potential challenges that would be against the strategic direction of my company.
Okay. When I was listening, one word that always sort of terrifies me that a company is the assumptions.
Yeah.
And so I just want to personally ask, what are some effective ways of a group or a company making assumptions, and what's the most efficient way and most productive way of making assumptions, and what are the stakeholders that need to be involved with that?
Yeah, so the takeaway is definitely not to make assumptions.
Yeah.
We're all making them, but I would just say verbalize them, write them down, and share them, because that's the easiest way to be like, oop, you're totally wrong, right?
Or if we're all making it the same assumption. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I started off in the data warehouse, and an assumption that I made was that we had 20 million customers at the time. And I realized that people were had very different definitions for customer, and one person defined customer as human. This is a credit card company. One person defined credit card as customer's credit card, and then one person defined customer as household. And we were making vastly different assumptions on how we even define what the unit was of a customer. Right. But until we got that out on a piece of paper, it was very hidden by these conversations we all have. So get it all on a piece of paper, write it down, and then share it with the stakeholders, and that way people can identify the ones that are misaligned.
And create alignment. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So on that, theme, Alyssa asks, what strategies or operating practices are most effective in ensuring that the strategic plan is driving work across teams? As an example, that all teams, all business functions are planning in alignment with organizational strategy.
Ooh, that's an easy question. So what I would say when you've got a really large organization and you're trying to kind of have some sort of unified vision, from a qualitative perspective, I'm a really big fan of what I call cascading storytelling and cascading buy-in. And meaning, what you can't do is be like, the CEO says this is what we're going to do, I'll do it. You need to have buy-in in the building and then the distribution of that message. So in an ideal world, people feel co-created into that vision. And that means that, the middle manager is talking to the junior people, and then they're having a senior manager meeting, and that's all feeding to the CEO. So everyone feels like they're being bought in. If that can't happen, at a minimum, what you want to do is have the CEO work with their C-suite and then have them share the message, the C-suite, with their senior managers. And then the senior managers share the message in their own words with the middle managers, with the junior people. And that way, everyone feels 1 degree directly communicated to about that message. It does take time. And again, in the fast-paced world that we're in, people hate taking time. But if you don't, then you're not going to have buy-in, and then nobody's going to implement your plan.
Well, and it sounds like you're talking about like an actual culture for the company.
Yeah.
And if you don't, it's almost like if you don't put it on the schedule,
Yeah.
it just isn't going to happen.
Right.
Because, one of our professors says that one of the most dangerous phrases in the English language is if it ain't broke, don't fix it,
Yeah.
right? He says, and he's a strategy professor.
Yeah.
He's saying, you should always be
Yeah.
fixing, you shouldn't wait till that point, because that's what you're basically saying. If you're waiting till that point, you're almost behind.
Yeah. I think Henry Ford said, if you asked people what they wanted, they would say they wanted faster horses.
Yeah.
And then we never would have had cars.
Exactly. So, what is in that sense, messaging is very important. So we have a couple minutes left. To the people who are watching this and the people who are dealing with this in their company and need to start now, when they press end on their computer today, what is one of the first 2 or 3 things that they can do to begin this process within their corporation, no matter what the size or what the culture?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is you need to yourself believe that short-term and long-term are not conflicting ideologies. I think there is this idea that you have to be one or the other, and there's a sacrifice for one or the other, but the two are very symbiotic. And so that would be just one thing that you should all take away. The two are not conflicting ideologies. Then I would say, honestly, pick whatever tactical tool I shared that you will find the easiest to do. Like, yes, I would say start at the beginning by defining success, but some people are going to stare at a blank page for 30 minutes and be like, I have no idea where to start. So if the easiest thing for you to start is by looking at the devil's advocate questions and just write down what are the 15 things that are keeping me up at night about the project I'm leading, that's fine too. So start wherever is easiest for you. And then for those of you who like to read, you can read the 3 books I mentioned, Start With Why, Lean Startup Rework. You could read Deep Work by Cal Newport, which is all about taking that time, especially as a senior leader, to carve out 2 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours a week to do some deep work and strategic thinking. And then the last thing I would say is find a partner in crime. These things are not easy. None of us has an extra 15 hours every week to be doing these things. So find someone who's going to nudge you and be like, hey, you listened to that webinar. Did you do anything from it? Did you read that book? Did you talk to your manager? And so finding someone to nudge you in this very difficult task, I find can be something to help.
That's great. And then in the end, it's about messaging, consistency, and also being able to tell truth to all levels of the organization.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you. This is very interesting information. It was wonderful working with you
Thank
today.
you.
Thank all of you for joining us, and we'll see you soon.